Welcome, everybody. We're in session 5, home stretch. Next week will be our last and final session of the training series, but happy to have you with us again today for session 5. So I'll quickly run through some housekeeping. As always, we invite you to be present with us. If you're able to close out of your email, flip your cell phone over for a while. 60 minutes in and out will get you some good information. And I think a lot of the stuff that we'll review today, you might find really, really practical and useful. If you're seeking that CE credit as a licensed social worker, please stay for the duration of the training, participate in discussion today, respond to any poll questions. So I don't think we have any of those today. And make sure you have your camera on for the duration of the training. That's required per the ASWB. Your questions and comments are welcome throughout. You can either unmute, jump right in and talk with us, or utilize the chat. You can send a message either publicly or privately if you're feeling shy. Send that message privately to myself or Ryan, whoever's not talking at the time, and we'll make sure that we get your question answered. There'll be a course evaluation at the end of today. Fill that out. We'll get you a certificate. I believe Ryan's been reminding everybody those certificates and that CE credit are coming at the conclusion of the training series. So we have one more week to go, and then give us a week or so to kind of get all of that information together, and we'll send you a certificate that includes your total hours attended and all CE credit you have earned. Our closed captioning is enabled. If you'd like that transcript to run at the bottom of your screen, just navigate down to your toolbar and click on Show Captions. If you have any other accessibility needs, you can always send a private chat to myself or Ryan. Send us an email, include it on your course evaluation. We'll try and meet whatever needs you have around that. So our agenda for today, as usual, we'll do a brief review of what we talked about last week. And then today we're going to spend some time talking about clinical tools that we can use to facilitate harm reduction conversations with our participants. So some of those tools are going to be the continuum of use. We'll talk about how we use motivational interviewing to facilitate these discussions. We're going to talk about the honest budget, which I know we've been alluding to for weeks now, so you'll finally get a chance to look at that. We're going to talk about the personal safety plan, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. The main learning objective we're focusing on here today is those harm reduction tools that you can use to engage with participants around risk behaviors. And I'll say next week is when we're going to get to do some of this demonstration of application of the harm reduction tool. So taking the tools that you've learned today and applying them to case studies that hopefully will feel a little familiar based on the work you're doing. And we'll do that next week. So just to start with our review quickly, what we talked about last week, in this training series, we've been working on expanding the idea of harm reduction as it applies to things other than substance use, how we apply it to mental health challenges, folks engaged in sex work, how we help people preserve their housing. But last week, we narrowed it back down a little bit to specifically look at how do we reduce drug-related harm. So we talked about some kind of like more palatable versions of harm reduction for substance use, like nicotine replacement, perhaps education on Good Samaritan laws, talking about budgeting and money management, some of the kind of like more traditional, giving people Narcan, naloxone, easier conversations to have. And then we also spent a little bit of time talking about the more challenging harm reduction conversations around syringe exchange and safer smoking kits, or talking about method of delivery, smoking versus injecting a substance, switching from a higher risk to a lower risk substance, and things like overdose prevention sites or supervised consumption sites. All of these being important to the harm reduction landscape as a whole, and really helping our participants to avoid potential fatal overdose. And along with that, we talked about high-risk transition points, right? So we defined those as any transition where someone goes from being surrounded by other people to relatively isolated, right? And so moving into their first apartment, discharge from inpatient behavioral health care or inpatient medical care, returning to the community from incarceration, all of these are positive changes, obviously, but come with a danger or risk and put people at significantly increased risk for fatal overdose. So we talked about some strategies to kind of mitigate the dangers with those transitions. And then lastly, we spent a little time looking at the risk setting tool, right? So helping folks to understand the risks involved with the substances they're using, their method of use, how much they're using, the mindset that someone is bringing to the situation, their thoughts, their moods, their expectations, how are they feeling? And then looking at the setting, the physical and social environment of where people are actually using and what potential harm could occur in that environment, who is around them, etc. So we want to just take a minute here. Welcome. I see people saying hi in the chat. Good afternoon, everybody. Just take a moment and see how are folks feeling with the content, with what we talked about last week. Have you thought about any of that since then? And maybe framing that with these 3 questions. What are you squared away with? What ideas are you still wrapping your head around? Or perhaps what did you see from a different angle? It can be about last week's content. It can be about something else related to harm reduction. We just want to check in with folks for a few minutes here before we move on.
Something that I like forget. I'm like, am I supposed to like raise my hand? But I'm just gonna jump in.
Just jump right in.
Yeah, it's been a long day. So something that I think would be nice, or like, I remember us talking about the setting situation, or risk setting, and I'm still trying to figure out / would like to practice like how I really like bring that into conversation with a client, which maybe is part of what we're doing today. But just thinking about like how do we organically like make that happen, and like really integrate it into my conversations with clients.
Ryan, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways, or like 2 things that happen in tandem. One is I think you can kind of directly ask the questions that are on the screen right here, right? Like, so without even sort of structuring it behind like, now today we're going to like examine risk and setting. It's more like, hey, tell me about like what you use, like, and you can use open-ended questions here. Like, tell me a little bit about how you do that, and like, what does it look like? And when you're using that way, like, what's your kind of emotional state, what are you feeling like usually when you're doing that? And so you're kind of noting the risk setting, and like that kind of guides your open-ended questions that you're using. And it doesn't have to be so stilted, right? Like you don't have to like treat it like a checklist, but as you're having a more open-ended, non-judgmental conversation with folks, you're kind of keeping tabs in your head around like, okay, I want to make sure I hit each of these areas. And maybe you'll spend a little more time on set, for example, because you notice like a high level of room to operate, right? Like, or places to enable greater safety for folks. Like if something sounds like, the risk and the set seem like pretty common stories that you're hearing, and people aren't using, the most risky ways, and whatever else. But then you notice in their description of the setting, it's like, wow, that seems like there's a lot of room to get safer there. Maybe you have more conversation, more open-ended questions, more reflection. And we'll talk about a lot of motivational interviewing a little bit later in the session today. But like, that's when we're bringing to bear those tools, ORs in particular, around the one area that seems kind of like there's room to get safer. So that's one approach. But then I think you probably heard me say that like we want to kind of give people these tools also, right? And so I think it might be fair to then like maybe wrap that discussion up and say, hey, these areas where we're kind of brainstorming how to get safer, that's what we would call the setting, right? Like, and so there are a bunch of components to how to be safe and how to be well while you're doing what you're doing. And so we kind of categorize those as risk and set. You could show them the tool at that point, right? Like, and so like when I was asking you these questions, I was trying to figure out if there was any room to operate in here. So having like a bulletin board printout of this might be helpful, and that way you can sort of visualize it with people. I think kind of approaching at first with like a tool like this can feel very like overly clinical, or like I don't like, who are you, like a professor, like get out of here, like you know what I'm saying? So I think that those two kind of approaches can happen simultaneously, but I think I like the idea of kind of open-ended questions in these areas that you're keeping tab of for yourself. I don't know, is that helpful, Fiona, or does it seem workable for you in your setting?
No, that's definitely helpful. I think like there's some tools that we use like really like paper to practice, like, and then there's some tools that just kind of, and this seems like a tool where it just helps us as clinicians or workers think about like the types of questions to ask. So I like how you phrased that with thinking like using this as a tool to see like where is there room for like trying to like make more safety in someone's behavior.
Cool. Maybe one or two other people. What have you been thinking about since last week, or over the course of the last couple of weeks in general? Seeing none, we will move on. I'll kick it to you, Ryan.
Yeah, so risk setting is like one of our tools that we use to explore these conversations through. And so we want to spend this whole next section talking about just additional tools. Some of them will feel like a bulletin board tool. Some of them will feel like an approach. So let's just dive in. And I think if you have questions like Fiona's just question there, like how are you actually using this? Ask those questions. You know, I'd be curious to know like what you think about using these tools, or whether you already are. So this first one is the continuum of use. Would love to hear if people are familiar with the continuum of use. What it is it's this kind of inclusive spectrum that covers managed use all the way to total abstinence, right? So what it allows us to do is get a little bit more nuanced around risky behaviors and drug use in particular in this case. So rather than kind of having all or nothing conversations about stopping or, you know, being abstinent from use, or you're like all the way chaotic, there's like this whole middle ground of the way that people use drugs to cope or to manage their lives. And so we can use this tool to help folks explore the pros and cons of their use as it exists currently in the moment versus what maybe they would like it to be, versus abstinence as another option, right? And so it allows us to kind of see where are you? Where do you want to be on this continuum? And then what reasons may come up that make you want to change your relationship to drugs, or stay the same, to change, to not change, which will sort of naturally lead to conversations around goals and strategies for the kind of overall therapeutic relationship. So the tool kind of recognizes that folks are going to be at different stages of their relationship to drugs or risky behavior, and that will target our interventions to that specific stage, kind of similar to like a stages of change model, right? Although once again, with harm reduction, we're not suggesting, we're not really in a place where we're saying no use all the way on one end of the spectrum is good, and severely persistent, chemically dependent on the other end of the spectrum is bad. So there's not like an ideal or best place to be. It's more just an acknowledgement of where you are, like what is the reality. And so remembering, again, people use drugs for different reasons. And so let's kind of explore these different stages, right? So we've got no use, aka abstinence. And this is where people are completely not participating in substance use or, you know, insert risky behavior here. We've also got social and ritual use. And to kind of break these up, they're slightly different. Social use is really kind of using substances exclusively in social settings, right? Or as some aspect of socializing. This is very familiar. Maybe people only doing Molly when they go to concerts with their friends, right? or only drinking wine at family gatherings. Pretty common stories that we hear there, right? Like I only like drink when I go to the bar with this one group of friends or something like that. So that's social use. We've got ritual use. So kind of using substances in a very specific way at a specific time or accompanying some specific behavior, right? So like only smoking weed to fall asleep at night, or using cocaine every morning or coffee every morning to wake up. Maybe having a beer every day after work. These are very kind of ritualistic, like time-based types of ways that people use drugs. Experimental use is where people are really kind of getting curious, right? They're exploring their reactions to different things. Ooh, what did that feel like? What if I added this in? What if I bumped it up just a little bit more? It's kind of casual in nature. And sometimes it accompanies social activity, right? People, the common trope would be like teenagers who get curious and experimental around drugs for the first time, things like that. But people across the lifespan get curious and use experimentally. I experiment with my intake of caffeine quite a bit. What does 4 cups of coffee feel like? It's not great. I'll just say that out loud for me. Then we've got binge use, right? Only 4. Things are becoming clearer. We've got binge use, right? So consuming really like an excess amount of substances in a short period of time. It could be that this accompanies more regular, moderate use, right? Like I use a substance, certain amount during the week, but then on the weekend, I really go hard. Or maybe I'm not using at all during the week and then I go hard, right? And so binging is one level there. And you can see it kind of, as we're moving up this continuum, we're progressing to kind of like more use, higher frequency, higher amounts, greater impact on lives, right? And so once again, in true harm reduction fashion, being transparent and honest about the effect that this is having on our well-being and our health, right? Next up is situational use, right? So using substances like only accompanying specific events or in response to specific situations, right? I've been drinking, so I might decide to smoke weed. Like it's in response to, ooh, I feel a certain way, and so I'll also smoke weed. Only drinking wine on holidays, right, with family, or only using benzos when I'm like really stressed at work, right? Like, ooh, I'm feeling like really stressed. Let me get my Xanax, right? Like that kind of a situation dependent stuff. Next is like more kind of abuse or chronic substance use or more habit oriented use, right? And so this is when things are really starting to cause more problems for us, like at work, at school, at home, in other social environments. And it may start to impact our health in a more negative way when we get into kind of more habitual use. And then lastly, this more kind of chaotic use, this persistent, really kind of compulsive drive to use substances, sometimes with like failed attempts to reduce our use or control it in some way. And so usually when we're at this stage, like our time revolves around getting drugs, using them, managing our withdrawal, recovering then afterwards from the effects of the drugs. There's usually not very much meaningful involvement in like work or education or employment or doing things socially. And so if there are physical and mental health issues kind of existing, they'll be exacerbated or they'll start to emerge for the first time in a significant way at this stage. So I present this tool in a similar headspace of risk setting. For us, it's a way to kind of assess in a more nuanced way, like where is somebody? But then we want to kind of ask some questions around like, you seem to be here. Where do you want to be, right? You seem to be using really situationally, but you talked about, how much more managed you felt when you were kind of using more experimentally. Tell me about that. Like what led to you being here now? Is that a direction you want to move back in closer to experimental? And what could that look like, right? So we have a lot of questions and places we can go through this assessment process. And so we can have conversations like this, where we're getting our participants and our members to to get nuanced in their thinking as well, right? And so we could start with a conversation like this. I want you to think of a person you admire or look up to. You know, where do they fall in the continuum of use? What does their use pattern look like? And so it's much easier to do this from the outside looking in, right? They're like an objective third party in somebody else's life. And they're saying their use looks like this. They seem to be really unhappy here, or they seem to be doing okay here. And I like that. I kind of want that for me too. Or I don't really like the way that they use, right? Bringing it closer to home. Think of a person you love. Where do they fall in the continuum of use? And explore those issues. And I think what we start to get into is this acknowledgement, this recognition that, like, again, use is not all or nothing. Risky behavior is not all or nothing. It's pretty human and typical set of behaviors. And so we can see that different people are at different spots on this continuum without judgment, right? And then we can sort of bring it even closer to home. What about you? Where do you fall in the continuum? Right? We're noting that, like, this person you look up to is here. This person you love is here. Where are you? And then we're acknowledging that our spot on the continuum is not static. We don't stay at a place on the continuum for our whole lives, or sometimes even very long. And so we can ask this question around, you know, where were you when we first met 3 years ago, when you first came to our program? Or where were you 2.5 weeks ago when you first started? Has anything changed? And so we can see the dynamic nature of people's spot along the continuum. So once again, similar to risk setting, it's a tool for us to help assess and target interventions toward. And it's also a tool for people to do some of their own self-assessment and decide whether they're okay with that or not, right? Once again, offering a level of choice and autonomy here through kind of a clear-headed view of what's going on. All right, let me pause there, actually. Oh, go ahead.
I saw Ricardo had his mic unmuted. I don't know if you were trying to jump in there, Ricardo, with a question or a comment.
Only when you think of a person you admire or look up to, where do they fall on the continuum, or a person you love? Where do they fall? And someone who may have been struggling with recovery for, a few years, and they have been, going through the conventional, traditional route, AA or NA, they have heard things like, don't compare, identify. And I'm just looking at this approach here, or these questions. Think about a person you admire or look up to. And anyone, who is, really digging into maybe the early stages of steps, they may need some help in, transitioning from that conventional, traditional, Mr. Bill W, compare, don't compare, identify mindset. And then, you start dealing with the culture of the recovery community and changing thinking. I'm just noting that you caused me to go there with these questions.
Yeah, that's really valid, Ricardo. Thanks. And as somebody who personally doesn't have like that 12-step experience, like that doesn't like hit me in the gut in any way, but I can imagine like having that experience and it's like, wait a minute, we're asking people to compare here. That feels very different. And is that okay? How does that land with people? That's a great point. I see Nathaniel's hand raised, please.
I mean, I think picking up on that comment, I think that there is a potential contextual bias or problems with the context that question is coming up in. I worry that asking that question to a patient, that they just because patients tend to have the assumption that I want them to be sober or want them to not use at all, that my asking it, or if we're meeting in the clinic and not in outreach, just the setting, causes them to, even if it's not even conscious, think of someone who is a person who is sober, and that I am trying to draw a disparity between their use and you could be like that person if you weren't using.
Yeah, we're kind of like coercing a sense of like comparison towards sobriety without realizing it, depending on context, I think is your point there. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Damien, I see your hand raised, please.
Well, I'm not working with teenagers right now, but it's worked with teenagers in the past. And I can see the young people being like, fuck daddy. You know, and how do I really don't know what would be an appropriate way to, you know, in a positive way to address that.
Yeah, I think you're right. You could get some of the some of that language and some of those ideas. And I think so, as I'm just reflecting on your conversation, all of you so far today, I think that's important context to note, right? Like, so as we frame our questions, maybe you don't ask this specific question on the screen. Maybe it's, hey, I notice you hang out quite a bit with such and such. If we had to like imagine, where do you think that they are on a continuum of use? The purpose there then is to like take themselves out of themselves for a second, right? And to understand, and I think to Fiona's question earlier, what's the ideal outcome of the exercise? To understand that that like risky behavior or drug use in particular falls on a continuum, and that we're able to apply that. It's kind of a way of demonstrating non-judgment, right? Non-judgment, and once again, I'll keep using this word nuance. And so sometimes it can be helpful to like kind of to disembody a little bit, put it out there so that I don't have to talk about my own personal experience yet. And then when we see that everybody's got some experience along the continuum, maybe we can get closer to talking about you. But I leave it in your hands, right? Like, you're the ones that know your folks best about how you would frame a question like this. Maybe your relationship is such that we sort of explore the different levels of the continuum, and I go right to, where do you think you are here, right? Like, if you had to like identify, right, like to use that language, where would you identify on this continuum? And we can apply the same level of non-judgment to that kind of a conversation without comparing. And so I think it is possible to do that. Depends on the person. Depends on the person. Let me stop talking there. Any other kind of thoughts people are having there?
I'm just going to say an approach that I like is starting with the end in mind. Identify the end. Where do you want to be? Where would you like to be? And then have that on a storyboard or right there. And then start exploring different means by which to get there. Do we take a train, a plane? Do we row a boat? You want to do skateboarding? What? But let's look at what it takes to get back to your 7-year-old daughter. What does it take? What do you think? So let's look at that.
I think that's a great point, right? Like, not only kind of centering the goals, but also maybe you're centering like kind of more, even more narrow, nuanced goals around behavior, right? Like, what is your goal behavior also to get to those larger goals? Starting from the end is, I love that. That's a great tip there.
Ryan, I wonder if you remember enough of it off the top of your head to talk about, we have a slide in another training where we talk about measuring success with harm reduction and what some of the participants in our integrated care clinic have defined as like what success looks like for them, or like what the end goal has looked like for them. I just feel like it feels applicable right now.
Yeah. So, typically you look at the research literature around success with like medication for opioid use disorder type interventions, right? Like MOUD interventions, harm reduction, right? Like, and so typically the research literature will be like, well, how much HIV testing are you doing? Uptake of the medication, et cetera. And so we did a year-long study here in our integrated clinic at Pathways, and rather than sort of use those typical measures of success, asked the participants themselves, like, what do you think of a success through this type of an intervention? And the answers were very different, right? The answers were optimism, right? Like feeling good about their lives, not being chemically dependent. That was another one. People didn't want to be dependent on a substance. And just like overall well-being, I think, was another one. And then lastly, like the third thing on the list was, I'm struggling to remember. Oh, it was like being able to stay clean and neat, being able to take a shower every day, right? Like these kind of basic human wants and needs, right? And so that's how people measure success. Is this medication going to help me so that I feel well enough to take a shower every day and I don't show up to your office like pungent, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, just a different framework for what success looks like. And yeah, I think to Ricardo's points around like, what do you want? Putting that in their hands, I think this is a great use of a tool like this.
Thanks for that, Ryan. I love all these comments. I think they are leading us very naturally in this direction, right? So thinking about motivational interviewing, right? Obviously a very useful tool for engagement. Motivational interviewing is sometimes described as like a way to get people to change, right? A way that clinicians can help to convince our participants to like do what we want, right? And I think, as you can hopefully see, it doesn't really fit into the approach that we've described for harm reduction work this far. And I don't think it's a correct description of motivational interviewing, right? So motivational interviewing kind of assumes that the most effective and beneficial changes are going to come from the individual's own motivation and desire to change, right? And long-term change is going to come from the individual's motivation and connection to what they want and believe is important, right? So motivation is informed by somebody's willingness, by their readiness, and their ability to make changes, right? Which means that just because somebody wants to change doesn't mean that they're ready to change. It doesn't mean they can change. It doesn't mean that they're actually going to follow through on that change, right? Think about all of the times that you told yourself, like, I'm going to stop staying up till 2 a.m. looking at memes on my phone, and I'm gonna get up and go for a run before I go to work, right? This is my own stuff. That's what I do. Every week I tell myself, this is a week I'm gonna start going to bed at a reasonable time and getting up early. And it just never happens, right? So motivation fluctuates, motivation changes, right? So we know this idea of change as a process, not an event, right? So what is our kind of role in this process? As the provider, right, we have to recognize that change is going to be uncomfortable for people, and that the ambivalence we experience before deciding to make a change is normal, right? For most of the folks we engage, they're going to see good reasons to continue using substances and some good reasons to abstain, right? There are some good reasons to like go to bed early so you can wake up early, and then like also sometimes I'm like, it feels really good for me to wind down at the end of the day until 2 o'clock in the morning staring at memes on my phone, right? It's like it's normal to kind of struggle back and forth with wanting to make a change and the ability to follow through on it, right? Habits are like these well-worn walkways through our brain, right? We're used to walking them over and over, and forging a new path is challenging. It's hard, even when it's something that we want to do, right? So the idea with motivational interviewing is it's going to give us the tools to like walk alongside people through the discomfort of that ambivalence, right? So that they can consider the best options for them in light of their own values and interests, right? And so this idea that when a behavior comes into conflict with a deeply held value, it's usually the behavior that changes. So the ways that we can have these conversations, right? Like there are a lot of conversational techniques associated with motivational interviewing. It does require a lot of practice to get good at it. But the ORS method can be like a really simple way to start approaching some of these conversational topics, right? So the O standing for open-ended questions, things like, tell me what it's like to use opioids, or tell me what it feels like for you when you use, right? Or what are your thoughts on abstaining from opioids? What are some important reasons you might want to explore MOUD, MAT, right? Medication for opioid use disorder or medication-assisted treatment. Tell me some of the challenges that you encountered when you started using opioids, right? Open-ended questions. The A is for affirmation. So things like, thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I must say, if I were in your position, I don't know how I would have managed to handle that, right? You're very resourceful. I think a lot of the times we condemn a lot of our participants' behaviors as like maladaptive coping skills, right? And we fail to recognize that those maladaptive coping skills help to keep people alive for a really long time, right? And sometimes we're very, very useful for folks. Reflective listening. So this is when we're kind of trying to take a guess at what our participants are saying and then deliver that information back to the client. Trying to put ourselves in our participants' frame of mind, trying to understand them. And this can help our participants to really feel like they're being heard by us, right? And gives them the opportunity to clarify if we've misunderstood something that they've said. And then the S is for summarizing. That's your kind of like, and what else point, right? I've heard you say that you don't want to stop using, but at the same time, you've mentioned that you've had a lot of medical problems arise from your substance use, right? So encourage our participants to kind of keep going with what they're talking about and like draw together any change talk we're hearing from them, right? So we want to link our summaries to what we've heard folks say earlier in the conversation. And this is where we can kind of start to help folks clarify around ambivalence a little bit, right? Yeah. So I attended a workshop by Sal Corbin, who's from Baltimore, and he talked about, is it motivational versus manipulative interviewing? It was at the Harm Reduction Coalition conference back in October. And I heard him there describe motivational interviewing as kindness with skill, right? And so Ryan and I train on all kinds of stuff all the time. We train on housing first model, we train on harm reduction, we train on assertive engagement, we train on boundaries, ethics, and confidentiality. And like the one consistent thread through all like 35 different trainings that we offer is like, it's about relationships, right? Everything that we talk about really boils down to how do we have an effective relationship with our participants? I think we do that by just like, we got to stop trying to solve people's problems. That's not our job, right? Instead, we need to just kind of submit to the process of connection, right? We have to try to rid ourselves of our expectations for what we want and how we want people to behave or how we expect people to behave, right? So motivational interviewing, when it's done well, is really about prioritizing our relationships with participants, not prioritizing an expected outcome of some kind, right? So there's no like expected or typical ending of a participant's behavior, right? So when we're having these conversations with folks, we're not there to solve their problems. We're not there to have all of the answers, right? When we don't know what to say, supportive silence can give folks a moment to think and reflect and come to their own conclusions about what should happen next, right? You'll often hear Ryan and I say in Housing First, the most important question that we can ask somebody is, how can I help, right? We're not here to like put a cape on and swoop in and solve everyone's problems, right? We're just here to accompany folks on their journey. And I really love this quote from Dr. Rachel Riemann, who's a teacher and a practitioner of integrative medicine. And she says, healing is not a relationship between an expert and a problem. It is a relationship between human beings, right? It's not like we went to college and graduate school for X number of years, and so we read about these problems in a book and now we know how to teach you how to solve them. It's how do I foster a connection with you and have a relationship with you where it's based on honesty and openness and trust, right? And we can help folks make their own decisions about what's going to be best for them. Can pause for questions or comments or feedback there if anybody has any.
I think it's a good time to like re-acknowledge. Oh, did somebody have their mic open? I was going to say that like that is such a tiny touch on motivational interviewing because there's so much to it, so many different skills to bring in. I see you unmuted, Mike. Hit us.
Yeah, thanks. So I like this. I like the notion of motivational interviewing, but I can't help but think that there is a goal in mind about trying to get to a better outcome at some point, if you can, if it's possible. It just seems like that to me, but please push back.
I was going to say, you know, I think that's where we get to the concept of like meet people where they're at, but don't leave them there, right? Like it's okay to also show participants what else is possible, right? And we can provide information on how folks can increase their safety and how they can increase their bodily autonomy, right? Like as those being the two main end goals with harm reduction, but not marrying all of our conversations to the idea that somebody should be pursuing abstinence, for example, right?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, motivational interviewing is not about educating per se, although sometimes we can ask permission to educate and provide advice, but only in the context of permission, according to MI. But it's about evoking stuff that already lives within our participants. And so thinking about, well, there is a goal in mind, maybe, but that goal really should be client derived, right? Like what, even thinking about the continuum of use and like what endpoints you want, to Ricardo's point earlier, that's their goal, right? And so motivational interviewing is really useful in resolving ambivalence that people have towards reaching the goals that they want to reach, rather than saying, here's a goal. I know you're not ready to like pursue it yet, but eventually I'm going to push you towards it. It's, where's your goal? I can help you resolve. I can help you do some decisional balancing around getting there, provide some advice around getting there. But ultimately, it's all client derived. We're eliciting and evoking that from the folks that we work with. But I think our organizational contexts and the productivity requirements that we are under don't always allow for a very patient approach in that respect. This is like the long game, right? And you know, obviously, our motivational interviewing is used in all kinds of contexts. For us, I love the opportunity to like work in a permanent supportive housing type context. We got the rest of your life. We can have these conversations if you know what I mean. I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful at all, Mike, but that's our framework.
Can I share an example that I encountered at the beginning of my work and see your reaction? Because Mike, I think that this is an example that I think of, and I bet Fiona can guess who I talked to. I had a patient who was bitten by a dog and had been in pretty active use and refused to follow up on it. And he was calling me from his room and saying it's getting swollen, and now there's a ring around it, and now there's a ring around my leg, and it's swelling up my leg, and just refusing to engage in care. He just wants to tell me what's going on. And someone I work with was like, so say to him, if you want to die, we can have that conversation. But unless you have that conversation, my job is keeping you alive. And these are the steps that, you know, these are the options we have to pursue that path. And I think it had never occurred to me that I could acknowledge to a patient that they have the right to choose to die, it still seems like a really complicated thought to have. But it snapped the conversation into focus. And it worked. Yeah, I think, yes, there are obviously outcomes that we want. Like, I didn't want the patient to die, but these are choices that they have, I think, is kind of the vantage point.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. I don't know if I like 100% am like, yeah, that's MI to a T, but that doesn't mean it's not effective, right?
No, it's about the perspective that patients have a choice. I don't think that it is actually MI. It's just about like how far. I think it's something that I still would find challenging to have initiated as a conversational point of view myself, but just how far respecting that these are people who have free choices can go, or that's
Like as far as possible in that case. Yeah, good example. Thanks for sharing that. I'll also kind of highlight this concept, although I think Miller and Rolnick don't talk about this in the same ways that they used to when they like invented and published on MI, but this concept of rolling with resistance, right? And so we should never be arguing, because the kind of human nature around like, I want you to pursue this goal makes people dig in their heels and go the other way when they're faced with ambivalence, right? And so sometimes we're like, you go the other way. You say, I do not want you to get care for this leg or whatever, and sort of see, because it's just not worth it for you. Well, no, I mean, I do want to have my leg, then they start arguing the other way, right? It's a sort of a silly way to use that technique. All right, let me keep us moving here. Another component, another like technique, it's the only, in addition to ORS, is the readiness ruler. I think we might have talked about it maybe once before, a couple of times before, but so yeah, kind of just like helping people discover their own interest in considering or making change. How important is it for you to do this change, to make this change? And the answer to that question on a 0 to 10 scale gives us places to continue to go. What would it take? The common one is like, why are you a 3 and not a 0? Well, then you'll hear people's reasons for why this change might be important. What would it take to get you from a 2 to a 3? What would have to happen in your life for this change to occur? And so we can use this 0 to 10 type scale, very kind of concrete way of looking at things across these different areas. How important is it? How ready are you? And then how confident are you? Which the confidence ruler is likely to bring up potential barriers, which offers us a lot of like rich places to do work with people, right? Like to help reduce barriers, to understand people's contexts. And so we're using ORS that Andrew mentioned earlier, open-ended questions and affirmations, reflection, and summarizing within the context of these other more specific conversations about change. So that's the readiness ruler. It is a common MI technique. Want to get into the honest budget? We love this. We talk about it all the time. It's just a budget, right? We all know budgets. You look at what's coming in, you look at what's going out. And so we attempt to have a more honest, very non-judgmental conversation with people about their funds in relation to their larger goals, their endpoints that they're seeking. And so it's kind of a way to, yes, realistically plan for their expenses versus like, tell me the thing I want to hear, which is you're going to have enough money to buy food for the rest of the month, right? People will tell us what we want to hear all day long and nothing will ever change, which is a form of resistance. And so the honest budget is much more clear about what's happening. And it sort of promotes this idea of choice and self-determination. Show you what it looks like here. I know that's a little small, but on there, you'll see things like, money going towards child support, debts, cigarettes, household supplies, other people you're supporting, partying shows up on here, sex shows up on here, gambling shows up on here, right? Like no holds barred, right? You would want to put anything in here that is like true and realistic for the participant of where their money's going. And then on the flip side, where am I getting that money? And sometimes it's maybe somewhat more unsavory places that they're getting money, panhandling, selling my prescription, selling my Suboxone, doing research for $10 a pop, treasure hunting, sex work, right? Like all of these ways that are not commonly talked about if you were to go see a CPA, right? So a tool that we use often around, when we think about maintaining tenancy, around how we're going to make sure you're paying your rent and having enough to eat by the end of the month, when we see that those things maybe are not happening. We have this in like tip sheet format. We will send you a copy of this along with the slides at the end of the session. Keeping us moving just because I don't want us to run out of time. But if you have questions, drop them in the chat. This next one is safety-based goal setting. And so thinking about risk or high-risk behavior, using a safety plan, right? And so many of us are familiar with safety plans from other contexts, right? Like suicide prevention. It's common to have a safety planning type intervention. And so it's a plan that's for the client, right? And we want them to have their own copy of this plan. Obviously, best, like with other crisis planning, to do it before it's needed. So if you're engaging in high risk behavior, we want to sort of map this out. I like this in tandem with risk setting, right? Like in terms of identifying potentially risky moments in people's lives and then planning around it. So it's got a number of components. First, we want to look at personal triggers, right? Like what will lead you to this high risk behavior? What will be risky about it? What makes it even more risky? Thinking about internal resources, right? Coping skills. What do I know from like a harm reduction education point of view? What do I know how to keep myself safe? Thinking about natural social supports and distractions. If a given thing that I'm doing seems like too unsafe, too risky, too scary to me, are there people that I can pull in from my social supports that will help distract me, right? Like not get to the root of the issue, but just sort of like take my mind off of things and get me out of there. Ways to adjust our environment for safety, right? Like these are client-derived ideas around how we can adjust the environment. And so you can see the way it kind of like pairs with risk setting here. Listing, labeling, being very detailed about professional supports that you might be willing to reach out to. And then the last component is making sure that there's a sequential order to accessing each of these things, right? So when I'm triggered, when I'm engaging in high-risk behavior that is too much or things aren't going well, first I'm going to call my brother. When my brother doesn't answer, crap, what do I do next, right? And so kind of having an order that I can go through without having to think too hard. And once again, we'll have a paper copy of this is useful here and kind of go right down the list. Our example that we use here at Pathways looks like this. What are the signs I might be in a bad or dangerous place for myself or others? Things I can do to take my mind off my problems. People who can help distract me if I'm feeling unsafe. And right, like listing names and numbers here. Places I can go to take my mind off of things, right? Like if sometimes it's helpful for me to just go sit on the pier next to the river and just like be alone. Things I can do to make the area around me safe, that's environment. Professionals or agencies I can contact. Hopefully we show up on that list, but hopefully other organizations and professionals show up too, right? Like having a well-rounded set of supports is important. And then lastly, the steps for what to do when I'm feeling bad and I might need some support. Here's our example. Okay, we did it. Those are all the tools. I apologize for kind of rushing towards the end, but we do have some time for like just additional questions. And I'll kind of ask these two wrap-up questions if it's helpful. What's one new idea or concept you learned today? Maybe what's one thing you would like to try or share with your colleagues? So any of the above, you can ask about, comment about, push us on. It's all fair.
That last form you shared, that personal safety plan, I've seen that. I would think we've used the or we have that honest budget kicking around somewhere. But that personal safety plan is something I've seen before, but not in my agency. So I'd like to maybe share that around.
Cool. Yeah, happy to contribute that after the session. Honest budget would be cool to try. I see in the chat. Yeah, it's fun. Andrew, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like moments when you've used the honest budget like successfully, or like times when it sort of makes the most sense to whip this out as an intervention.
Well, I think the honest budget like is only useful when you're working with folks who are going to be forthright about where their money is coming and going, right? If you try to use it with someone who is not ready to talk about that stuff openly, or you don't have that kind of rapport with, it's maybe not going to be as effective. But I think that using the honest budget, we'll have folks say, we make a budget and then they don't stick to it, right? And as providers, we get really frustrated, right? Oh, we put all this work into making the budget, and then they threw it out. They threw it right out the window, right? But I think there's like learning that can happen from that experience too, where then the next month we sit down and we talk about what went well with the budget, what didn't go well with the budget, and using some of these tools together, right? Like using the readiness ruler along with the budget. What is somebody's like readiness, willingness, ability to follow through with using the budget, right? And getting folks to think, about what their own priorities are and what their investment in making those changes can be. I think is when we've seen some of those conversations go really well with folks. I did drop a link to the evaluation for today in the chat. And just a reminder, next week, we're going to spend some time kind of looking at some case studies, talking about these tools, the harm reduction principles, and kind of pulling from previous sessions, applying all of that to real life participant scenarios that we've seen at Pathways next week to kind of talk through how do we facilitate, how do we prioritize conversations around risk reduction and things of that nature in the context of working with folks in permanent supportive housing and trying to preserve their tenancy in their units and things like that. Any other last minute thoughts, questions, comments?
Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for being here. I guess we'll see you next week.
All right, y'all have a good one.
Take it easy.